Have you ever noticed something subtle after 60? Not pain exactly, not illness, but a quiet difference in how your body responds to things you've eaten your entire life. Like the same breakfast doesn't quite feel the same in your joints anymore, or your body feels slightly heavier after meals you never questioned before. Most people ignore it because it feels like normal aging. But here's the strange part. Sometimes what we label as aging is actually just the point where the body stops responding the same way to things it has been exposed to for decades. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What if one of the most trusted parts of your daily diet isn't behaving exactly the same way in your body anymore? Almost everyone grows up with the same idea. Vegetables are always safe, always helpful, always something your body can handle without question. That belief is so deeply repeated, it doesn't feel like a belief anymore, it feels like a rule. So even after 60, most people never revisit it. They don't question it, not because they've tested it, but because they've never been told to doubt it. But here's where things quietly shift. Because the body doesn't stay identical across decades. And when the body changes, but the assumption doesn't, a small gap starts forming between what you believe is helping you and what your body is actually reacting to. Most people never see that gap until it starts showing up as small, unexplained changes. And if you start looking closely at those changes, one interesting pattern begins to appear. It's rarely the obvious foods people question. It's the everyday ones. The ones that are so normal, they disappear into routine. In fact, one of the most commonly repeated examples in discussions around this topic is something almost every kitchen already has. Used in salads, sauces, cooked meals, daily routines. So familiar that nobody really thinks twice about it. Tomatoes. And before you jump to conclusions, this is not about labeling them good or bad. It's about something far more subtle. How the same food can feel completely different in the body, depending on time, frequency, and long-term exposure patterns. Something most people never consciously track. And this is where it gets interesting. Because after 60, reactions are rarely dramatic. They're quiet. A little stiffness in the morning that wasn't there before. A slower warm-up feeling in the joints. A subtle heaviness after meals that used to feel light. Nothing strong enough to alarm you, but enough that something feels slightly different than it used to. And because it doesn't feel obvious, the mind doesn't connect it back to food. It gets labeled as just aging. But what if that label is too simple for what's actually happening? Because when you compare people more closely, a strange inconsistency shows up. Two people can eat very similar diets, very similar meals, very similar routines, and yet their experiences can be completely different. One feels nothing unusual at all. The other slowly starts noticing small changes they can't clearly explain. And both experiences are real, which means the explanation cannot be as simple as this food causes this effect. Something else is influencing the outcome. Something most people don't directly observe. And this is where tomatoes stop being just a food and start becoming part of a repeating exposure pattern the body has to process over time. But even that explanation doesn't fully hold. Because when you expand the comparison further, the pattern still doesn't stay consistent. People with similar habits don't always get similar results. And people with different habits don't always get different results. It doesn't follow a clean rule, which is exactly why it gets overlooked. Because the human mind prefers simple causes. But here, simplicity doesn't fully explain the variation. And that leaves only one possibility. There is a missing factor inside the pattern that most people never isolate clearly enough to see. And once you reach that point, you start realizing something important. It's not just about what food is eaten, or how often it's eaten, or even how it's combined, because none of these alone fully explain the difference in experience. It's almost like all these factors matter, but none of them are the final answer. They point in the right direction, but stop just short of explaining the actual shift happening underneath. And that's where the real question forms. If all the visible factors don't fully explain it, then what is actually driving the change people are noticing? At this stage, the focus naturally tightens, because when you remove the idea that this is about isolated foods, and stop assuming it's just sensitivity or age, what remains is something more specific, a long-term pattern of repeated exposure that doesn't show immediate feedback. And that's the key difference, because what doesn't show immediately is usually what gets ignored the longest. And this is why the same foods can appear harmless in the moment, but still feel different across time in different people. Not because the food changes, but because the response to repetition is not identical for everyone. And that difference is where the missing piece starts to sit. Now everything starts to come together, because the real shift isn't about what is being eaten. It's about how long-term repetition quietly shapes the body's response range over time. And once you see that, all the scattered observations begin to connect. Different people, different reactions, same general foods, but different internal responses built over time. Not randomly, but gradually. And this is why tomatoes and similar everyday vegetables kept appearing in the discussion. Not as the cause, but as examples of something far more important. How repetition changes interpretation inside the body without obvious signals. So the missing piece isn't a single food. And it's not a warning list either. It's the realization that the body doesn't stay static forever. It adapts quietly. And what feels normal today is shaped by everything that has been repeated for years before this moment. Which means the real question was never, what should I avoid? But instead, what has my body slowly adapted to without me noticing? And once you start seeing it that way, even the simplest meals stop being just routine and start becoming something worth paying attention to again.